Early in October of 1869, Claude Monet and Auguste Renoir readied themselves for a painting expedition. Both of the young artists were desperately short of cash. It had taken them all summer long to scrape together enough money to buy their painting supplies. Now they were eager to experiment. Rather than transcribe the details of a scene, they wanted to capture a fleeting moment in time. The shimmer of water, the reflection of light, the movement of people. As Monet and Renoir painted by the River Seine, they were rejecting everything that was expected and traditional in art. And together with a few like-minded artists, they were about to launch what was not just a new style of painting, but a revolution in the world of art. A revolution that would become known as Impressionism.
Impressionism is now seen as a very comfortable art. We love it. We find it very serene and pleasing. Impressionist art, when it happened, was the toughest, most radical, most challenging art of any period in history. It was one of the big breaks in the history of art.
There's a story in Impressionism of overturning the past and starting the history of art all over again. But there's also a marvelous story of a group of individuals who were so different and so brave and so humorous and so willing to work with each other that they could make this incredible thing in the history of art happen.
Claude Monet, uncompromising and demanding of himself and everyone around him. He expected fame and wealth from the beginning. Auguste Renoir was nostalgic and respectful of artistic tradition. A painter of modern life, Renoir would eventually turn his back on all that was modern. Berthe Morisot was brilliant at maintaining an image of absolute respectability, at a time when it was not respectable for a woman to be a professional artist. Camille Pissarro considered himself an anarchist, but in practice, he was kind and soft-spoken. His friends thought of him as God the Father. Edgar Degas was argumentative and obsessive. A perfectionist until the day he died, Degas could barely bring himself to call a work finished. They shared one simple but entirely radical idea: that it was time to discard the rules of the past and paint what they saw through their own eyes, through what they called their sensation. In the spring of 1859, a young, aspiring painter took the long journey from the Normandy coast to Paris. The young painter was 19-year-old Claude Monet. He was eager to get his first look at the Salon, the state-run art show. The Salon was a huge event. Hundreds of thousands came each year to see art jammed floor to ceiling in gallery after gallery. In 1859, there was no such thing as Impressionism. The art on display was academic art. And the most respected works were full of mythological or religious themes and were known as history paintings. Monet hoped to one day have his art exhibited at the Salon, for acceptance in the Salon was the only way an artist could gain real recognition. But Monet had no intention of making history paintings. Still, he did want to stay in Paris and develop his craft as a painter. His father agreed to help him with an allowance, if he studied with an established master. Monet took the allowance, but ignored his father's wishes. He joined the Académie Suisse, which wasn't actually an academy, but a space where artists could come to draw the nude without instruction. When his father found out, he was furious.
The long-standing tale is that his father cut him off. He felt that if he wasn't going to be part of a studio, that this was not the way he's supposed to go about a career, that if he was going to live higgledy-piggledy in Paris, then that was his choice, so he would have to make it on his own.
It was still normal for an artist to have to go through a process of drawing from casts and then drawing from the live model and learning from the art of classical antiquity. Monet already felt, when he first went to Paris in 1859, that an artist should learn from what he saw around him and not learn from formal rules. And at the same time, he's clearly somebody who cultivated an image as a teenage rebel. He's always concerned with projecting an image of somebody who acquired notoriety not only through his art, but actually through who he was.
I could never bend to any rule, Monet once said, even as a very small child. Claude Monet was born November 14, 1840, the second son of Louise Justine and Adolphe Monet. They were hard-working merchants in the port town of Le Havre. The young Monet had little interest in school, and he spent as much time as he could on the cliffs and beaches around Le Havre. From early on, he loved to draw. By the time he was a teenager, Monet was making caricatures of notable Le Havre citizens. He was quite good at it, and before long, the local stationer displayed Monet's drawings in the shop window. His work sold well, at 20 francs apiece. While at the stationer's one day, he met a local landscape artist, Eugène Boudin. "I hope you are not going to confine yourself to this sort of thing," Boudin said, and he invited Monet to paint with him in the open air along the Normandy coast. Boudin helped spark Monet's passion for landscape painting, a passion that would never leave him. Monet described his work with Boudin as if it were like the rending of a veil. "I understood," he said, "what painting could be. My destiny as a painter opened up before me."
Monet probably expected to be famous from very early on. The first painting from his hand is a highly accomplished picture that was submitted to an exhibition in Le Havre in 1858, and it is spectacular. It is also an example of an artist who was truly gifted. So he knew he had it within himself to go down into history, and he was determined to do it.
In the spring of 1859, Monet left Le Havre carrying his art supplies and his life savings of 2,000 francs. He was headed for the capital of art, Paris. At the Académie Suisse, Claude Monet met another student who had no interest in academic training. His name was Camille Pissarro, a 29-year-old from the West Indies island of St. Thomas. Like Monet, Pissarro wanted to portray everyday life rather than the mythology of the past. Pissarro had in fact painted scenes of everyday life from the time he was a boy in St. Thomas.
From the beginning, he sketched these portraits of young slaves, but with none of those kind of sentimental, fatherly type of approach. There's a directness and a simplicity that was very, very unusual. Clearly, he felt very much at home with people of a different context, of a different social milieu from his.
Pissarro felt at home with people of a different social milieu because he did not feel at home within his own community. Pissarro's father, Frédéric, a Jewish immigrant from Bordeaux, France, had married a member of his own family, his Aunt Rachel, breaking Jewish law. The Jewish community in St. Thomas would forever scorn the Pissarros for this illegitimate union.
Camille Pissarro was the ultimate outsider. St. Thomas is a small place, and when your mom and dad aren't legitimately married and, you know, they're not recognized in the synagogue and the other Jews don't like them and blah, 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 it's a kind of situation in which you have to learn to persist and to keep on going.
By the time he was a teenager, Pissarro knew he wanted to be an artist. But his father wanted him to help run the family store.
Pissarro's father expected his son to pick up the business and to become a dutiful son who would follow his parents' footsteps. Not only did he not do that, he ran away from home to become what? An artist, God forbid. This is just something that was absolutely unacceptable.
When Pissarro ran away in 1852, he left behind his middle-class life, determined to make his way as an artist. He traveled through the West Indies and on to Venezuela. And in 1855, he settled in Paris. Once there, he managed to reconcile with his parents. They had recently moved to Paris themselves and set up housekeeping with a generous staff of servants. One of the servants was 21-year-old Julie Velay. She posed for Pissarro in 1858, and the two secretly began an affair.
He happened to fall in love with a very simple woman who barely could read. Not even the cook of his parents, but the cook's help.
When Pissarro broke the news to his parents, it gave them the shock of their lives. Julie was not only a lowly servant girl, she was Catholic, and she was pregnant.
Well, Pissarro's mother just absolutely refused to have anything to do with Julie.
The Pissarros fired Julie and cut off their son's allowance. Julie suffered a miscarriage. But Pissarro refused to leave her. They would go on to have 8 children over the next 21 years. And their relationship would last the rest of their lives. Pissarro's mother never acknowledged Julie, but before long she put aside just enough of her outrage to send her son a small monthly allowance. Camille Pissarro escaped the family turmoil by concentrating ever harder on his landscape painting and figure drawing. While sketching the nude at Académie Suisse late in 1859, Pissarro met Claude Monet. Pissarro and Monet were soon off together on painting expeditions. They portrayed scenes that had traditionally been considered unworthy of attention. A telegraph tower, an open field, a dreary factory.
They painted subjects that were not imbued with cultural meaning. If I went out and painted the suburbs, you'd think, oh my God, what is this? Is there any meaning in this? And that was what the French thought. By choosing their own countryside, they did something radical. They made images out of an unholy or an unhistorical landscape.
There's no doubt that the notion that we, in the 19th century, that is, were in a new age, contributed to the desire for artists and for musicians and the like to be able to look at their time and to find the values in that moment. Not to look to the past or to mythology, but to really look at the ways in which their own civilization was reshaping the concepts of the world.
Monet could not have been happier, except for one thing. Between his painting trips, the studio costs, and his particular enjoyment of big city nightlife, Monet was living beyond his means. His savings of 2,000 francs was quickly depleted.
Life could be relatively cheap if somebody had somewhere to live. Obviously, subsistence is one thing, comfort is something else, and Monet certainly, ideally, expected comfort.
He always loved fancy shirts with ruffles on it. He liked to drink better wines. So there were occasions plenty of occasions, when he was short of ready cash.
But Monet did not get much time to make his way in Paris. In March of 1860, he was conscripted into the peacetime army for 7 years of service. Monet's father offered to pay the government for a replacement for his son, a common practice for those wealthy enough to afford it. In return, he wanted his son back home to help in the family store. Claude Monet refused the offer, and instead opted to join the cavalry in Algeria. He felt that an adventure in Algeria was preferable to a mundane life as a shopkeeper. But Monet paid a heavy price for his decision. His career as an artist was now on indefinite hold. Early in 1861, Auguste Renoir enrolled in l'École des Beaux-Arts, the School of Fine Arts, the training ground for academic artists. At the age of 20, Renoir had already had a successful career as a porcelain painter. But at the École des Beaux-Arts, he soon ran into trouble. Renoir had entered a studio class run by Charles Gleyre, an academic artist who insisted on the primacy of drawing, line, and form. Renoir liked to paint with brighter colors. Gleyre was concerned that devilish color, as he called it, might go to a student's head.
As polite and as respectful of authority as he was, I think when he came to paint and draw, even from a very early time, he did not accept any tutelage. He was not prepared to have someone tell him that this was not the way to do it.
Gleyre saw little promise in Renoir, and Renoir's wealthier classmates saw him only as an outsider.
He starts off coming from a lowly background. Renoir gets himself into a quite different world because he becomes a fine artist. He moves from being an artisan or a decorator to painting fine art for art exhibitions. He goes into this world that people associated with elevated status, which is totally different from this humble background that he came from.
Renoir had grown up the sixth child of 7 in the slums that stood in the shadows of the Louvre. But instead of running with the boys in his neighborhood, he roamed through the great museum, absorbing the work of the masters. As a little boy, Auguste decorated the walls of his home with drawings made from charcoal he'd taken from the stove. When he turned 15, his parents apprenticed him to a porcelain painter. His new boss was impressed, and the young Renoir was soon earning the handsome salary of 20 francs a month. Renoir carefully saved every centime he could to fund his art education. And in 1861, he began his official studies in the studio of Charles Gleyre.
I was always quiet in my corner, very attentive, very docile, studying the model, listening to the teacher, and it was I who they called the revolutionary, Auguste Renoir.
Renoir kept up his studies at Gleyre's for month after month, doing his best to capture the line and form of the model. Renoir had been at Gleyre's for an entire year when 3 new students entered the studio. And soon he was part of a circle of like-minded friends, which included Frédéric Bazille, a 21-year-old with plenty of money, Alfred Sisley, a Parisian born of English expatriates, and a 22-year-old fresh out of the army, Claude Monet. After a year of peacetime cavalry service, Monet had come down with typhoid fever and was sent home to recover. Adolphe Monet once again offered to buy out his son's army service. And this time, he would allow the young Monet to go back to Paris to paint. But first, he made his expectations clear.
Get it into your head that you are going to work seriously this time. I want to see you in a studio, under the discipline of a reputable master. If you decide to be independent again, I shall cut off your allowance without a word.
Monet immediately set off for Paris. And in the autumn of 1862, he entered the studio of Charles Gleyre. Like Renoir before him, Monet ran into trouble with Gleyre.
Not bad. Not bad at all, that thing there. But it is too much in the character of the model. He has enormous feet. You render them as they are. All that is very ugly. When one draws a figure, one should always remember the art of classical antiquity. Charles Clair.
I can only paint what I can see, Monet replied. He stayed with Clair to keep his father happy, but he was an uninterested student. Monet soon led his new friends, Renoir, Sisley, and Basile, out of the studio to paint landscapes in the open air. Camille Pissarro, Monet's friend from the Académie Suisse, joined in their expeditions. Monet drove himself hard, and he pushed his friends to do the same.
Monet puts himself under a lot of pressure physically when he's working. And I'm sure that when his friends were working with him, that he would have expected them to do just the same. And as he was, in a sense, the leader, the most charismatic of them, I'm sure they'd have followed suit. They would have done what he asked in order to show that they were worthy of tagging along with this great force of nature that he was presenting himself as.
Monet had established himself as the leader, the driving force behind his small band of artist friends. Monet, Renoir, Sisley, and Pissarro would be at the center of a new movement in art. It would be a decade before this movement would be called Impressionism.